Welcome to this restorative justice life. I'm your host, David Ryan Barcega Castro Harris, all five names for all the ancestors. And today we're continuing our series highlighting dope restorative justice practitioners doing restorative work in the South. Q, welcome to this restorative justice life. Who are you?
I am a daughter of the Caribbean or a child of the Caribbean, depending on the day.
Who are you?
I am a person that loves to laugh with community.
Who are you?
I am a facilitator who loves crafting generative spaces.
Who are you?
I am, this is a great question. I am um, a lover of all things in water. Yeah.
Who are you?
I am a person that's trying to leave the world a little bit better than when I got it. Yeah.
Who are you?
I am a believer in the little miracles that happen every day.
And finally, for now, who are you?
I am Quincie Demiana Doucette Baron for all the ancestors.
Mhm. Beautiful. We're going to get to the intersections of so many of those things throughout our conversation. But I just want to say up front, part of us doing this series highlighting restorative justice practitioners doing work in the South is to support the upcoming restorative justice conference, the Remix gathering coming up in October. Do you want to tell the people a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for queuing that up. So, for JA, the Florida Restorative Justice Association will be holding a conference called the Deep South Conference RJ the Remix, and that'll be happening October 20th to the 22nd. And we're hoping to have a gathering of folks who are practicing RJs in all different remixes and ways, hence the title, and offering some workshops to kind of orient folks around what those things look like around the country, with a kind of specific focus on what that work might look like here in the South. But of course, everybody's welcome. And yeah, that's the conference that's coming up. Check out
Beautiful.
freejaw.org to sign up.
Beautiful, beautiful. And over the course of this conversation, we'll be highlighting some of the work that you're doing in, the US geographic South, specifically in South Florida. But
Mhm.
before we get to any of that, it's good to check in. So to the fullest extent that you want to answer the question, how are you?
That's a great question. Thank you for asking it. I'm doing well. I'm in light spirits right now. It's not one of these rainy weeks in South Florida. It's one of these sunny ones. So just trying to relish in the sunshine of it all. How about you? How are
Fair.
you, David?
Oh, well, thank you for asking.
Yeah.
This conversation is going to air a little bit after we're actually recording this, but I am in the midst of doing a lot of work supporting schools as they're getting started, to set off on the right foot doing restorative justice work or like implementing restorative justice work. So, subtle plug, if you are part of a school or, I work with all kinds of organizations who are interested in doing this kind of work in your community, holla at your boy and check out the links down below, to learn about the ways that you can learn as an individual or learn on a community level. So the stress of that is relevant and present, but I'm really locked in, ready to have this conversation with you. We've been chatting before we started hitting record, and I was like, come on, stop that. We got to get this on.
Hold
We
it.
got to get
Hold
this
it.
recorded. So let's get to it. You've been doing restorative justice work for a minute now, longer than you even knew the word restorative justice. So, from your own perspective, how did this journey get started for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. I I feel like I've always had faith in the ways that communities are able to relate with each other, and I just feel like there's a certain magic to that. And so I'm noticing in the reflection of us talking even beforehand, that everything in terms of the work that I've done, but really even the networks that I've operated in, has to do with how do we fortify our relationships with each other.
Mhm.
And when it comes to the work that I've done, where there's a lot of overlap in youth development work and um, empowering youth, or uh, really empowering youth, I think it's more allowing youth a space and place to see how their magic can amplify all great things. And sometimes that takes a level of support from one another and your peers who are kind of in it with you, in that phase with you, to be able to do so. And so, in all the things that I've ever done, uh, there has been a specific way that we move through process in which we try to get everybody, or we always get everybody's voices who might be impacted by a certain situation, a certain thing, come together collectively to try to figure out what are some of the moves that we want to make, and be intentional about supporting that person along, to fulfilling whatever that plan looks like. And so, yeah,
Yeah, what
it's
were some of
been
the early
everywhere.
models of that?
Yeah, okay, so that's a great question. I used to be, funny enough, when I was in high school. This is so fun. Okay, when I was in high school, I went to a private school for high school. I've done all iterations of, I went public, charter, and private. The last couple of years of when I was in school, I was in a private school, and I was a facilitator, for like a peer facilitator for eighth graders, ninth graders, and like with the younger crew of folks. And so that is what it's wild because this is just coming to me now, but one of the things that we used to do is if there was conflict at a moment, and in the retreats that we would hold, there would be specific spaces and places where we would have folks in smaller groups kind of think through what is it that has been really heavy in terms of the dynamics that they've had with their peers in their classes, and provide some space for folks to reflect in different mediums, like a writing space or like a shouting corner, or like we even have like a like how are you moving it out of your body, and then created spaces for folks facilitated and mediated spaces for folks to have those conversations if those folks are actually on the retreat with them. So I think that that is one of the first like early trainings that I didn't even realize was a part of this like longer lineage of how communities have been moving through a sort of practice for beyond a millennia. So I think that's the earliest that I
Yeah,
can think through.
for sure. So you know, like from the early years, like that was something that you knew was available to you, but like what made you want to step into that kind of space? What was it about those
Mm,
spaces that were like, oh, this might be a little something that I'm interested in uh learning more about?
yeah. This is these are great questions. I you know I wouldn't say that I was, and I've since actually learned. Shout out to Kimberly Crenshaw and all these folks that do work in terms of folks who are socialized as femme growing up, and mad curious and loud, such as myself. I would have been categorized, especially in the public school system in the Miami-Dade County school system that I grew up in, as a child who was like a bad child, and I spent a lot of time in like principal's offices, or like indoor suspension or detention. And a lot of it was, there was no space for me to have a conversation about what went down. There was no space for, and I think it was really hammered down that what you thought and what you think does not matter. This is what needs to
Mhm.
happen, and you need to fall in line. And without context or a conversation, I since I found out it's very difficult for even adults in some of the processes that I moved through, to be held to that expectation. And I think from very young, there was an understanding that even though, I grew up in a Dominican Haitian household, my parents did not play that, being in trouble at that rate, though I had pretty decent grades. Um, I did know that the conversations that I was having with my friends about what was going down, or even the ways in which there was this expectation of like you could treat youth in any way, shape, or form, because, um, yeah, there's just not anything valid to say. It's just really this like militarized way of like getting them to a certain point just isn't a way that is conducive to how fun and inspiring being in a collective, in a space that's like social and also like about learning can be. And so I think I started actually doing that facilitation stuff in eighth grade. And I
Mhm.
think it was about there's something really, really magical and like still feeds my soul about being in small groups and creating space for folks to have this understanding, and especially young folks to have this understanding that you're not only does your voice matter, but you are the expert of your own experience. And that expertise can be used to channel and fill out any vision that you have for the questions that you're having about what the world looks like. And you are deserving to have a space to be able to shell that out. And I think like when I got that first taste of what that looks like, I just couldn't let it go. And when I was after I left college and I was trying to explain to folks what I do, I was like, essentially, like I'm just still the same facilitator. I'm just getting paid to do it now. So I think that that's where that comes from.
Yeah, which is a labor issue and an equity issue that doesn't always get addressed. We can circle back to that in a little bit. But when we think about, the conditions that led you to being that person who was able to like develop those skills, uh, you know, I imagine part of your work now is like coaching and helping adults like create those spaces. But what was it for you as a child, as a young person, that
Mm,
like made those spaces welcoming, inviting? What were the things that adults did that were like, oh, this is something that like is for me, bad child that I
yeah,
am? Yeah.
yeah. I think it took also like I think it took adults who were grounded and had an understanding that um, and a belief that youth can do it. I will say there
Mhm.
was friction. There was a
Yeah.
certain point where I was asked to be and had to go through like this interviewing rounds of sorts to be what they called. I don't know what they called it. It was like a peer minister, which is essentially just like I'm no minister, but essentially is just like you get to really be at the helm of crafting what these things look like. And even though the folks that ran that program were like, I think you would be fantastic for it, the school administration stripped me of the title because they were like, you can't have this person as like an example, but that looks like. Um, and so I think it took adults who were willing to sit back and understand that just because you've lived a longer life doesn't mean that you're the expert on how to exist, and create space for young people to be able to collaborate and coordinate with each other to kind of get into the groove of what existence can look like, what looks like right now, and what it can look like in the future. So I think it took adults, and even in the adults that I work with now, because part of the things that the evolution of the work that I've done is coaching coaches to do kind of this similar work. Um, is a lot of having those conversations. It's like, but how are you relishing in their expertise, and how are you creating space for that to be aired out?
Yeah, this idea of expertise and
Hmm.
buzzword like authority, right,
Yes.
is really tricky. I know you've been appreciating the episodes we've recently put out,
Yes.
reflecting on Abbott Elementary, and
Yes.
there's this discussion that popped off in one of the comment sections of one of
Hmm.
the videos that we put out around something that happened in episode 13 of
Okay.
season one, and I'll like highlight it here just for your
Yeah.
sake and for the viewers who haven't quite listened or watched
Do
those yet.
that.
But
Do
again,
that.
here's the plug. Go watch those videos, go listen, share it with all your educator friends as an easy on road to learning about restorative justice. Plug
Yes.
over. Right in season one, episode 13, it's the end of the season. They're on this zoo field trip, and Barbara
Yes.
and Janine are having this conversation on the bus, and in the back of the bus, the kids are being rowdy, and Janine stands up and yells, "Sit down!"
Yeah.
Right? And Barbara is taken back, and like that is on the show seen as a moment of like, oh, Janine has arrived as a teacher, and Felina and I, in the
Yeah.
context of that discussion, were like, okay, I'm not saying that there is never a time to raise your voice, but
Right.
what is the impact of that? What are the dynamics that are being perpetuated, right?
Mm.
I think Felina, in the context of that conversation, she was saying that, I had a moment like that, and the student came back to me and was like, I'm not a dog,
Oh.
right? Like, why are you
Yeah.
like treating me like that, right?
Yikes.
Students have this ability to like have conversations with you, young students, right?
Mhm.
What are the things that Janine and Barbara didn't do as the students came onto the bus that like, hey, we do need to like be in our seats. We do need to be like
Mm.
some level of quiet for our own safety. And like, what is the thing that we could have done that reminded students of that instead of
Yeah.
commanding them, right? These dynamics that adults have, right? Just because we are more experienced in the world, just because we have XYZ job title, like we
Mhm.
expect this level of like quote unquote authority of respect or like, and I'm not saying that like are not worthy of respect, but it has to go both ways,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm. Mhm.
We're dealing with young people who are also full of life experience, who
Yeah.
are also valuable contributing members to your community. And what are the
Absolutely.
things that you need to do in order to cre- create the conditions, right? It sounds like in your
Create
experience,
the
right? There were
conditions,
some,
David. Create the conditions.
well, right. It sounded like you had some teachers, adults in your
Yeah.
life. You're like, yeah, like we believe in you. And then like administrators were like, no, like
Absolutely not.
we need like those, we need people who are like our peer ministers, peer counselors, whatever title you're calling them, like to be like these pristine, like angelic,
Mhm. Mhm.
cherubic, like young
Yes.
people who like do no wrong ever, right?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Whew. I appreciate you bringing up that example because I feel I had a similar situation that happened with a student. And it was in one of these programming sessions that I was in where we were working with these students, and like I think the other part of what you're sharing is the challenge in trying to navigate in a different way is that the training in order to get to these quote unquote like spaces is a programming tool of itself that flattens and makes a narrow vision as to how you can relate to a student, right? Like, and so you're also fighting like you're kind of unprogramming while the programming is still trying to like telling you that this is the only way to move. I
Mm,
had a situation where I was working with a student a student. We all got off the bus. It's wild. These things always happen on a bus. And one of the students that were in this collective, this cohort of folks that were going to go off to school together, um, it was like, I have some really hard news and I would like to share it with my group. And as the student was talking, this other person in their cohort just started laughing and like said a joke. Probably wasn't paying attention to this, and I got very stern, which my students are not accustomed to me being like snapping almost. Where I was just like, "Did you just hear what this person said? Why are you reacting in this way?" Um, and I could just see kind of that person shrink into themselves. And the day or two afterwards, I actually called them into a one-on-one, and we had a conversation about what that looked like, and um, the storytelling behind what happened, and they're also their own processing of what happens when these really heavy things are shared was not something I was creating space for in that moment. And um, even though it's funny because I've had this conversation with my own Barbara in my world where they're like, I don't know why you even had to have that one on one. Like this person was acting out of pocket and you clocked it in that moment. And I was like, yes, but if something similar would have happened to an adult, I would never say that. Like I would have never just snapped. I probably would have pulled somebody to the side in that moment. I would have said, "Yo, did you know?" You know, and so why not extend that same courtesy to a young person, if especially if these are the values that we're saying that we're trying to move through and share with students. And so I think you're absolutely right. What are the conditions and the containers that we're creating for folks to have an understanding of how we're trying to move? It's not always going to work like you're sharing, but it is an important question to constantly be reflecting about, especially in such an important position like uh, su- supporting the shaping of what a student will experience in their education.
yeah, and I understand like all the structural barriers to having those conversations, right? A lot of times people are like, well, where's the time to do that? Right?
Right,
It's like
right.
you create the time.
That
You create
part.
the time for the things that are important for you. And if like that's not an important priority for your school or for your organization or for the culture of the space that you're working in, like I understand like why you might be resistant to that.
Yeah.
That's why we're saying, hey, let's challenge this idea of authority and the way that we are with students like as a whole, right? Like it
Yeah.
can't just be on like individuals to like correct behavior, but like individuals do have choice, individuals do have
Yeah.
agency and can
Right.
decide to uphold these values moment to moment or not. None of us are
Exactly
ever
that.
going to get it perfectly.
Hmm.
Um and when we are imperfect, when we fall short of doing that, we can always make amends, we can always repair, right? Doing
Yes.
restorative justice work
Hmm.
is about engaging in that process of building, strengthening, as well as repairing relationships when harm occurs. And you know, we all cause harm in those in circumstances. Um,
Exactly.
you, you know,
Exactly.
we've talked about like the informal ways you were introduced to these ideas, but when did capital R, capital J come on to your purview?
Yeah, I was in like a 2 week training for RJ, and it was actually a RJTJ Transformative Justice collab, and um, it was just like a couple of folks um, in the the like organization that I was working for. It was like one of these things. It's like, oh, you can add this certificate or whatever.
Hmm.
And so I did that training, and though I was really grateful for the foundations that were provided in those spaces, I was really curious how this could happen in praxis, and specifically like centering community structures versus like this organization that I was working with. And that's actually where I met Jay, who I think is going to be showing up on another episode. Actually, Jay and Cindy, who I think is going to also be showing up on another episode,
So
because
Jay
we were
was last week, Cindy will be next
next
week, but
week.
yes.
Okay, I'm in the center. But we were part of this restorative justice, transformative justice. Um, that was the crux of what we were working through, and it was a gender-based violence
Mhm.
training that happened. I think that also was like a 2 weeker, but it also tied into us building out programming, which was really cool. So it was a very specific ask in terms of um, how are you sharing back these skills and how are you applying the skills in that share back. And so I think, whereas I did have like a formal training, I think that that one was a lot more impact. I was very impacted by that training because, first off, it was intergenerational. So there were young people who were on there, and also like grandmamas that were up there, like kind of circling, and then actual parents that were having conversations with us and moving through these different exercises. Um, and it really expanded my understanding of how RJ practices can work outside of like, let's write this into a policy. It's like, no, well, how does this actually work when we relate to one another? um, so I did that training, and then I had another, like I had a couple different iterations of formalized training. And then the next formal training was working with an organization, because I was part of as part of facilitating a restorative justice diversion program. And so then figuring out, okay, so how are RPs going to work when braided with the state's expectation, which was a very interesting, yeah, it was a very interesting task. And so those
Yeah.
are the iterations of my formal training.
Yeah, and so I guess I do ask this question typically towards the end,
Okay.
but I think it's worth saying now. As it stands now, like what is your understanding of restorative justice?
Mm.
Define it for yourself.
For myself, okay. I For me, this is fun because I've been thinking a lot more of restorative practice, so it's interesting to like zoom back out a bit. I think that restorative justice is a way to get to some sort of homeostasis to move towards transformative justice. How do we kind of get to a place of, um, it starts with an H, homeostasis
Hmm.
within a community network, to then be able to get to a place where we can imagine beyond whatever implications we were dealing with that fed into us having to deal with said harm in the first place. I think that right
Yeah,
now that's where I'm at. Yeah.
I guess it bears asking how do you define transformative justice then?
Whoo, so much fun. Okay, transformative justice, I think, is envisioning and this is not, I don't have the technical term on hand because I'm no academic, but for me, transformative justice, where restorative justice is how do we figure out a way to get back to or to create a space where we're at this like homeostasis, this like feeling for the most part balanced. I think transformative justice is like, okay, now how do we reimagine the structures that are at play um, that fueled the harm that got us that kind of that fueled us having to do RJ in the first place or RPs in the first place. I think an example of that would be for me like a student who stole a purse in a school, and it was the teacher's purse. And we would move through like a restorative process to kind of figure out how we can be accountable to the harm. What are some action plans that we can build out as a collective and as community representation to be able to remedy said harm and move to a place of accountability. And then I think the step of transformative justice is to say, okay, but like some of the things that the student was sharing in the circle is that they come to school hungry, that they uh, don't have the resources to like come to school in uniform. And so, how are we reimagining um, the barriers to how that student can look like? Maybe we need a pantry. Maybe we need a we need some sort of community program that's happening here. So I think maybe it's a stepping stone sounds too linear, but to me
Mhm.
that's kind of the domino effect, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. I just wanted people have a grasp of like what you mean when you say these words for the purposes of our conversation, because
That's fair.
part of doing restorative justice work is like collaborative community agreements. And so like as we're having this
Yeah.
specific conversation right now, like what is it that we mean when we throw around those terms? And
Mm,
when I'm thinking about the specific applications of this work, like it will change context to context, right?
yeah.
From gender-based violence to youth empowerment to whatever's happening in schools, what's happening in diversion programs, which I wouldn't label restorative justice. That's just diversion, which is great in of
Well,
itself as a harm reduction thing. Jay and I talked about that on the last episode. If you haven't watched or listened to that, go tune into that. um, but when we think about the way that this work has played out in your life, right?
mm,
What are some of the things that you have like learned that have been like super important to like practicing well?
mm, yeah. That's a great question because I had a moment where I was doing all of this community. Well, I'm always doing community work, and
Mhm.
I felt like I had this moment where I was just like, how am I turning this inward to my family network? Like, can I say that I do all this stuff in praxis, even though like I work through it in my friend circle, my chosen family circle, and do I apply it to the first network that I was ever a part of? You know, and so there have been instances that have happened in my family where I literally have been like, all right, we're about to do a circle. And, my family is always like, here we go. Here's the college degree. All right, which I have to deal, I come across. And I think one of the things that are important, and it's funny because Jay and I were just talking about this, is that there are different levels of success that should be lauded as such. It's not just about getting to the end game of woohoo, we got to a community circle, and then we got to this action plan, and this person did the action plan, and that's what success looks like. It's the presentation of having this as an option to folks is a success in and of itself, especially in the underserved and marginalized communities that we work in, because when those alternative considerations are not typically offered at scale in the ways that we're trying to work to have those things offered, and other organizations that will be joining your podcast is trying to offer. It's also like a person sharing that they have been harmed and feeling validated and reassured in that is another measure of success. A person that has committed the harm, having a conversation to even think through, okay, like I guess this accountability process is interesting, even if they say no. Again, bringing that up is another measure of success. And so I think not being boggled by the end game, which for me can be, I'm a Virgo, so I'm like, how do we check all of the boxes? It would be great if all the boxes get checked off. But that can't be the only measure of success. And I think the other thing that ties specifically to that is um, active listening. And I know that that can be a buzzword, but listening to understand versus listening to react to a thing because you feel, oh, I got a resource or I'm really excited to, it's like,
Mhm.
how are you just understanding the testimony that's happening in the moment and then being intentional about how you're tailing the way that you move through a flow to support it.
Yeah, those definitions, like active listening, buzzwords, like reflective listening, like intellectual empathy, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
those are things that like are important to like define for people. Those are important skills to build for folks,
Yeah.
right? But wanting to sit with like the breadth of what you just shared as like things that are important, right? Like there are lots of ways to measure quote unquote success when we're doing restorative justice work. And it's not
Completely.
necessarily conducive to what institutions are wanting, right? Like they want outcomes, right? They
Mm-hmm.
want consequences, right? And, you know, another word that we can redefine consequences, right? When people say consequences, they often mean punishment, right? Or
Yeah.
actions that will happen to somebody, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
they did a thing, right? But we know that consequence is consequence, like whatever happens after with sequence, right? So the consequence of somebody like doing this action has been like now they have greater self-awareness of like the harm that they caused, and
Mm-hmm.
like while we might
Mm-hmm.
not have a action plan in this moment, right, that is something that is worth celebrating. The consequence of um XYZ harm happening. Let's say it's you know, this teacher and student, like this teacher who had their pistol, and like the student understanding like the impact that they had on that teacher, and like the teacher being able to express to the student like the broken trust, the
Mm-hmm.
fear, and like the concern that they have for themselves and their community when their belongings go missing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know
Mm-hmm.
like the specific conditions
Yeah.
of, you know, that specific story, and that's not necessarily what this conversation is about. But you know, those things are success in and of themselves,
Mm-hmm.
right? Whether or not that student repeats that behavior again is also important, right? We
Yeah.
don't want students
To do it again.
uh
Correct.
stealing from other people, right? But like, does detention prevent them from doing that, right? Does
Mm-hmm.
suspension prevent them
Mm-hmm.
from doing that either,
Exactly.
right?
Exactly.
So what are
Exactly.
the ways that we're making sure that like we're addressing the underlying needs, right?
Yeah.
Food.
Mm-hmm.
Is food accessible? Is food it are school meals funded in your
Mm-hmm.
state?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's not the level of conversation that you're having. Maybe it's what are the things that, you know, these people here who care about you in this space can do to make sure that you come to school fed. What are the
Yeah.
things that we can do to support you in building your life skills to like, hey, remember to eat before you come to school, or like
Yeah.
here are the places that you can go. I'm
Mm-hmm.
reflective of a peer conference similar situation that I had with a student, not for stealing, but like who was habitually late, right?
Mm,
Um,
mm,
and that's because the they were new to the neighborhood, and they were going to the closest corner store that they knew
mm.
um, before they went to school, and so like they were just late. And you
Yeah.
know, this is a student who definitely needs coaching. This is a young person who like definitely needs coaching on like planning out your day and
Mm-hmm.
getting places on time so you're not missing learning. And like we can
Yeah.
lecture that student all we want, but like, hey, is there another corner store that you can go to that's on the way that's not putting you like 10 minutes behind?
Yeah.
Right? Like maybe that's part of the conversation instead of
Mm-hmm.
like, nope, detention because you're
Right.
late. Oh, we're docking your grades because you didn't turn in your homework on time.
Mm-hmm.
XYZ,
Mm-hmm.
XYZ. There are just so many ways that we can start to like really address those root causes instead of just like slapping somebody with a consequence, aka punishment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because to your point, does it work? You know? And if you're, to your point, you're just like, you're kind of just like putting your hand on all these like holes in the ship and just hoping that we're going to get to the destination. And that's not always the case. And I often think, um, I know that you're going to have Power You on here and Jose, and there was a time we just ended up having a conversation with the school board, and I will let him talk about like how dope the work is of young people advocating for RJ to be part of the budget of the school board.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but what I noticed in my time there in supporting Power You and their requests was they open it up with this. Why they're there basically, and they're like, we're here for students to feel like they are safe and for students to feel like um, they can build the skills that they want, and they can build the skills that are necessary to do the things that they want in the world is essentially how they started it off. And my response to them was, and when we were able to share different testimony, it was like, I think it's very exciting that that is the reason why everybody's here. And it's always really excited to be in a space where there's a collective goal, much like when, you're in an RJ circle, because there's always this collective goal, tying those things together. But in order to be informed as to how a student might feel safe and to know what tools students will need, you need the student's voice to be able to do that. And so, in what ways are you leaning, going back to this expertise, in what ways are you leaning into the student's expertise to be able to craft intentional spaces and containers and tools for students to both feel safe and also do exactly what you're claiming that you want them to do, which is to do what they want to do in the world. And that, you know, I don't think it ruffled any feathers, but there definitely was just like, which is fair. That happens a lot, and a lot of different youth spaces that I've worked in where I'm like, okay, but like, what do the youth think about this? And they're like, what do the youth think about this? That's a great question. It's like, oh, you're just going to throw this policy on them and like not have any information. Um, I think to your point, what I love also about working with youth is that there is a level of expansiveness that just feels inherent. Um, and if you are creating space for that expansive to shine through from youth, you can also, to your point, reflect that back in what are options in this space that would then be like a skill share situation for a young person and an adult to move through. So I think that's a fantastic,
Yeah.
fantastic point.
And like, are our institutions, are our organizations used to creating those spaces? No, they're not, right?
No.
They're like very much top down.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, adults have this idea, adults discovered this resource, and we're going to implement it because like that's the greatest new thing. It's data driven, blah blah blah
Mm-hmm.
blah.
Mm-hmm.
Students like get on board.
Yeah, they
Right?
Abbott Elementary, get on this iPad.
Yeah, I like thinking about like so many examples in Abbott. Again, if you haven't
Yeah.
gone and watched those, go back and rewatch them, because I think the thing that keeps coming up over and over in that show is people making decisions on behalf of other people, right? We see
Mm,
we see Ava doing that for the school as a whole. We see
yeah.
Janine and Jacob and lots of other of the staff like making
Hmm.
decisions on behalf of their other colleagues or on behalf of their students without that consultation. And that's so real. And that happens all the time within organizations, within schools. And sometimes those are great resources, really well intentioned. Those are the things that should happen.
Hmm.
Other times, and like people will feel good about it. Other times, that's the right thing that happened, but the way that you went about doing that just rubs people the wrong way,
Yeah.
right? Like making them feel disenfranchised, making them feel like they
Hmm.
don't have power, making it feel like their perspectives and their needs aren't important. They just wanted an
Hmm.
opportunity to be able to share.
Hmm.
There are other times when the thing, as well intentioned as it was, right, is actually harmful for your community, right? We can talk about the
Mm,
iPad episode, we can talk about the community garden episode, we can talk about
yeah.
the art episode, we can talk about like the gifted program episode. Like
Yeah. I'm
it
thinking of
happens
the
over and
fight
over.
one where Janine is like, no, they're going to be friends.
Oh, we
Two-
haven't gotten to that one. That one's in season
okay.
2. We'll
Okay.
get there,
Okay.
right? But like this culture of making decisions for youth, right, leading to
Hmm.
permissiveness, or like
Hmm.
enabling like harmful behavior, or like doing things to young people like in a punitive way, right? Like high expectations, no support, um
Mm,
it is also damaging. Like, your work is broadly defined as youth development with a restorative justice lens. Your work is broadly defined as youth development with a restorative, transformative justice lens. What are the ways that adults, many of whom are listening to this podcast, can do to share power with young people, as specifically as you can tell us?
yeah. Yeah. I mean, funny enough, this might not be a great way to answer this. I don't know why this image is coming to my head. There's this movie called, I think it's The Dead Poet Society with Robin
Hmm.
Williams.
Hmm.
And there's this scene where Robin Williams is supposed to be teaching, I think it's English. And instead of it coming from what I think is like you traditionally see, which is like, here's the notes on the board. It's like, okay, here's this word. what do you think about this word? When you like break it down, what does it sound like? I can't remember if it's that movie or another movie where he's a teacher in that way, but I guess I bring that example up to say, in what way, and maybe soliciting is not the right word either, but like, in what ways are you creating space for students to bring in their own ideas about a thing in the world? You know, it's
Yeah.
hard to build relationships with someone if you're not actually in creating space to be engaged in who they are. I find, and what I would say is like kind of my specialty, just because it makes me really excited to do, is having interactive spaces. So, like, I think about, I've had to like facilitate and teach classes at this college, and it was specifically about like job readiness skills and stuff that we were trying to for students that were specifically going to these different internships for these different organizations, corporations, actually, Microsoft and all of those. And the ways in which we worked on these job skills was to put students in like small groups to have a conversation about what is intimidating about this skill. So, like, for example, at the end of that, one of the things that happened as a staple in that program is that they have to come up with a business plan for a product that they create, and it has to be in front of. It happens in front of like the heads of these banks and like the heads of marketings for these different things that are actually judging these young people that have built a thing. And before, when I came into the program, the ways in which that was handed to students was just like, you're going to have this business plan, get ready. You're going to kind of have to get over your fear, whatever, and push past it because it's going to have to happen.
Mhm.
The ways in which I was really excited to remix it was okay, like, so we're going to build this out to like a 3 month skill by skill build up. And the only way that we can create a tailored way of addressing these issues was to be like, okay, so historically, when we look at the data and we do the feedback surveys, young people have a really big challenge with speaking in large groups because this happens in auditoriums, and feel very intimidated about their ideas being worth sharing in that scale. And so, okay, we have that data. let and it's also, it's just because of the power dynamics. I find it's easier for students to talk to each other about a thing and then have that in a large process, having a conversation. So what is intimidating about speaking? We're going to break you up in 5 groups and y'all can talk to each other about what that looks like, and then in 10 minutes we're going to bring folks together and you're going to identify a person from your group to speak and reflect back what was shared. And then we're putting all this stuff, literally, I'm writing all these things on the board. And then we are collaborating to create. Okay, so like, what if y'all were able to practice for 6 weeks? Like, if this is your challenge, would that feel a little bit better? And I know that I also am coming from, that's a standpoint of privilege because I'm not operating under, especially here in Florida, there's a rigidness of testing that has to happen. Like, you know, that's how funding gets. I'm sure it happens in all these places, but it's something that's really a big concern here in Florida, like getting these, it's not called FCAT anymore, but whatever standardized tests that they have to prep for. And being at the helm of that program, I had a lot of space to craft what the curriculum looks like in those spaces and to rewrite a lot of the curriculum. So I know that's a place of privilege. And I do think it's an invitation to think through in what ways are other, you know, some of the things that are still embedded in my brain is how like my 5th grade math teacher made thinking about money an interactive session where we're building a town with each other and we kind of have to come as a group to figure out how we're going to build these supplies to do this project, you know, together. And each of us have our little coins, but it's like an interactive way of talking to each other, and you're getting feedback in an organic way. So I know that I'm like going on a spiel a bit, but that would be, I think that that has been tried and true in everything that I've done, and that's with youth, but also in doing a lot of, I've built and offered a lot of community workshops, and that has also, like, adults love that too, you know. So that's what I would offer. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, and I think, the specifics of that like it might be like break people into small groups and ask a question that like is like on not like the deepest level but like a surface level that will like allow some ideas to start percolating, and then like
Hmm.
you can go deeper and deeper and have like larger group discussions. Like that's just good facilitation,
Yeah.
right? And those things are transferable from place to place to place to
Hmm.
circumstance, right? Like with people in general and young people specifically, right? But what comes out of those spaces is like the key, and right, you have to be responsive to that. Right, they're gonna
Hmm.
surface these fears. Like you
Yeah.
can't just like hear what they say and like, all right,
That's
cool,
cute.
now on to the next thing.
Right, right.
Right,
Relish in
it's
it.
like,
Relish in it. Yeah, absolutely.
right, like we have to make sure that like if people tell us things, if people tell us their needs, if young people tell us their needs, like, all right, let's figure out ways to meet those needs.
Hmm.
And you can be honest about the limitations that you have, right? I think,
Exactly.
when you're thinking about the people who are listening to this who are in institutions and organizations where they do have limits on like what they can teach in their curriculum, what time they have to allot to XYZ. One part of your conditioning as a restorative justice practitioner, maybe as an abolitionist, is to say like, well, what are the ways that I can betray the system in order to like do the thing that I believe is right? That's
Hmm.
one thing. And if we want to have
Hmm.
that conversation, we can. But two, it's to say to the people that you're working with, I want to build a classroom. I want to build a community here where we can be responsive to each other's needs, right?
Yeah.
Y'all have voiced some things that the rules of this school, the rules of this institution, the policies that we have in place, like don't allow us to do. So, what are the
Hmm.
things that we can do instead that will help us get to that a little bit closer,
Yeah.
right? That vulnerability goes a long way. Like it shows those young people that like, hey, you're on their side and we're
Hmm.
in this together. We're
Hmm.
struggling against like this institution, this programming, like these um guardrails that have been set for us together. But like, what is the thing that we can do to make this the best we can with what we have, right?
Yeah.
That might be like a little bit more of like that restorative space where like, what is the homeostasis that we can find in these conditions? A
Hmm.
transformative lens is saying like, well, what is the thing that we can like recreate?
Flip. Yeah.
Right, and what is the thing that we can burn down? And
Right.
there's space for both of those things, right? Like
Hmm. Hmm.
those kind of conversations can lead to like student activism, and if that's the way that you want to take that, by all means, uh
Yeah. Go through that lane.
support your students in that.
Hmm.
But making sure that like you're building space to surface those stories, surface those needs, and then being responsive to them
Hmm.
is super important. Because like if you create those conditions, build their stories, collect their stories, and like do nothing with that, they're like,
Yeah.
well, I just did that for nothing. This
Hmm.
person doesn't care. They're
Hmm.
just another adult who wanted to, I don't know, power trip, and now like
Yeah.
has my stories, has my needs, and like how's this gonna come back and bite me later?
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. I think you also bring up a really solid point about modeling what you'd like to see for students. I think I was working in a capacity that was trying in some ways to train students to move through a corporate atmosphere, but I also had this challenge. I ran into this like friction of like, I am not going to ask my students to do anything that I would not do. And so,
Mhm.
this whole like, that there's a certain dress code, that certain like all of this, we're gonna have to figure out a way to make this a model. Because the truth of the matter is, that is not how we as staff have to move. And if we're
Mhm.
not modeling what these students have to move through, there's also like a, well, you're not doing it, like mix. Like if you're not
Yeah.
doing it, then why are you gonna have me do it? And I think to your point, the modeling. Because I find, and I run into a lot when I'm working with. Uh, now I can just think of them as the barbers in school. But like when I'm working with folks who are like, there's a poise that I want to model. There is a certain diction. I think to your point, there's also opportunity to model vulnerability, because that is going to inform so many great expansion packs to your experience in the classroom.
Yeah. I love that you said it, expansion packs. um yeah, right, there are lots of ways to do things, and
Yeah.
I'm never going to be the person to tell someone like what they're doing is right or wrong in their
No,
context,
it's not
right?
my place. Hmm.
I don't know, like even as like a consultant who works with schools, right? Like I'm not going to like prescribe things, right? what restorative justice offers, from the perspective that I've learned over the years, and shout out to the homie Denmark who framed it this way for me. Like, restorative justice is both like a lens, yeah, that we look through, but also like a mirror that we get to hold up to ourselves. So like, hey,
Mm,
are our actions like building, strengthening, and repairing relationships in this moment? And right, for the
mm,
purposes of whatever context that you're in, like maybe professionalism and being buttoned up, like, is the thing that will like help you build credibility with the stakeholders that you're involved with in a
hmm.
given moment. And
Yeah.
that's the thing that you should do, right? You can have arguments about like whether that's upholding white supremacy by like code switching and conforming into those spaces. And like, I
That's
think
fair.
those are valid theoretical critiques, but like,
Hmm.
if your honest assessment of that is like, no, that's actually what's going to give me credibility with these parents, with my colleagues, with these young people, right? Like,
Hmm.
I think like that's the move to make.
Hmm.
Um, and then there are other times to buck that,
Yeah,
right?
there
And
are.
show up as your, shout out to someone I was working with this summer, Sergio, saying like you're showing up as like your authentic self, right? Like, there are moments for all of that, and there's not a one size meets all, but like when we
Yeah.
have that mirror that we're holding up to ourselves, or like that lens that we're looking through, like what is serving the relationships in the space, who's benefiting from this,
Hmm.
how am I able to have the next conversation
Yeah.
because like
Hmm.
I showed up in XYZ way. Like, those are the things that we really should be considering.
Yeah.
You highlighted like some of the challenges of doing the work that you do in Florida as it comes to like school mandates, and
Hmm.
we can talk a little bit more about that if you want to. But when we think about doing restorative justice work with youth, what are some of the challenges that come up for you that like maybe unique to Florida, maybe unique to the South, but like, let's be honest, happen in a lot of other places as well?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I again, like I have a I just want to acknowledge my purpose because working with youth specifically of the age groups of 26 to 17, um,
Hmm.
there and have I've done other sprinkled around, but like that has been like the core overlap. Um, there this is definitely not just in South Florida, but I should say, excuse me, not but um, some of the challenge I think I run into with working with youth is you kind of brought this up earlier before. It's like how are you? I don't know if I could trust this whole restorative vibe. I'm not sure if I trust this shit, quite frankly. And it's like um, being steadfast and patient in instances where like I'm thinking of like certain students who it took probably like a year and a half into a program for them to actually believe lean into being vulnerable enough to move through um, different stages of restorative practice. But had I not been, and had not only I, but had the community of folks that we were, what we call them learning communities, had we not been intentional in constantly being like, you have this as an option, we wouldn't have been able to uncover some of the challenges that were going down and figure out how to support in those different ways. So, what I do think sometimes we run into is, um, yeah, youth being like, this is just another ploy for you to like get me into some shit. Um, and I think the other challenge is that it's hard work. Like it's heartbreak. I think of it, the work that we do is hard work. Like it really is. Um, it's something that comes from the heart, but also can weigh on the heart. And so being intentional also about how you're taking care of yourself, because that will ultimately fuel like the health of how you're moving through in these spaces when you're trying to show up for these youth. To your point of a mirror, um, I think uh, there is a place where it's like getting the youth to be vulnerable is tough, but then also when you're in the space and folks are vulnerable, it can weigh heavy on you because you're just like, damn, I should say for myself, there are moments where I'm like, damn, it's so heartbreaking that these things are still happening, you know? And that these very specific ways that I thought were just specific cuts in the way that I experience a thing is also being reflected in this other student's experience. And so that is not a place where I need to be to your point, trauma bonding with that student in that way. That's a place to recognize, take inventory. There's this great thing that Jay, who was on your podcast before, has this thing called aura that when we're moving through. Shout out to the contractors here, by the way, because I also contract in different spaces. And actually, when we're working with students and teachers and admins, this came up, and it's called aura: observe, reflect, and adapt. And so, in what ways are you observing what's happening in your body? In what ways are then you reflecting back, taking inventory, and then making adaptations to tend to what shows up? And so I think that is the other piece. There's going to be moments, and especially when you're doing this heart work where a mirror is held up and you're just like, well, I wasn't expecting a fucking mirror to pop up right now. Take inventory of that. Tend to yourself, do some heart, tend to the challenges that are coming up, and make the adaptations that are necessary so you can show up in a way that you feel good about.
There are two parts to what you said, and I want to focus on the first part for a second, right? You
Yeah.
talked about how, young people are often in circumstances where there's like, oh, this is just another thing, right?
Hmm.
And, what about the conditions of South Florida or Florida, like, lead to like that kind of socialization from your experience?
Mm. Well, I will say, like, I can think of experiences as being both the administrator and the instructor in a space, and then like being the student that's in trouble here in Florida.
Yeah.
I think there were instances when I was in school where, especially schools that were like heavily policed in those areas, like going to school in Carroll
Mhm.
City and all of that, um, where it's like just tell me like what's really going on, and actually I think of like I had a space where a friend was asked to share what the circumstances were going through at their household, and also the impacts of like what happened in this classroom. And ICE was called, and the
Mm-hmm.
student was ripped away from. I mean, the person was ripped away from their family. They in a week's time, it was like, oh well, I'm stressed out because X, Y, and Z was happening, right? And it's because we have to work in a certain way at home. And then all of a sudden, in a week's time, they were in a nice detention center, their parents. Or for like an instance for myself, where it's like, well, I am um, having a challenge because whenever I am interacting with a certain teacher, uh, and I tell her that I'm not getting this thing, she has all this shit. She's, has all this name calling has to happen. And instead of it being addressed with the teacher, that is probably not the way, but that is not a conducive way in my for me to be able to, a generative way for me to be able to get the thing done. I was taken out of AP or like honor level classes and basically dropped
Mm.
down. So it's like, um, are you going? I think that there is a history, or even being an administrator, and I think that this is also where the privilege comes in, where I'm like, I was running a program that was programs that are deeply tied with school, but I am not necessarily under the same
Yeah,
like
yeah.
I'm like of it, but I'm not of it. And you're dealing with, I had this instance that is still challenging for me to think through for this day, where I have these students taking a very difficult class, and the ways in which this person feels that it's motivating, and maybe has been in the case, is to say, out of all these students that are taking a chance and taking this really hard class, only 3 of you are going to pass, because the majority of you don't have. I could see your scores, and this whole like you telling me you're having an issue with the homework, there's no way you're going to pass this class. And so bringing that teacher into a restorative practice, and having a conversation with the chair of that space, and being like, okay, so this is the way that we have found is helpful for our students. What are some of the ways that we can kind of find a middle ground to like move and operate in that way? Because what I am noticing right now is that that's not helping. But again, that could have only happened if there was a container that had already been in place where students could be like, listen, the reason why, because we used to get progress report. The reason why I'm not doing well in this class is because what's the point? This person's telling me there's no way that I'm going to do well in this class, and that's after me asking for help. So I think
Yeah.
that there is just like all these different ways in which, going back to this active listening piece, people are reacting to young people being vulnerable, instead of figuring out ways to understand where they're trying to come from and co-create solutions to the challenges that they're dealing with.
It's not like these things are unique to Florida or the South, right? Like
Hmm.
these attitudes exist in our liberal or progressive bastions of, Southern California, the Bay Area, the Pacific
Hmm.
Northwest,
Absolutely.
Chicago, DC, Denver, Minneapolis, New York, and now I'm
Hmm.
Boston, and now I'm just shouting out like the most downloaded areas of this podcast, right? But like there are urban centers where there are people who like generally believe in these ways, but like
Yeah.
these attitudes and these structures still exist in the institutions that you're participating in, and
Hmm.
like what are the ways that like we can make legislative policy changes, sure, if that's where your energy is, but like what are the individual choices you can make within your sphere of influence to create the conditions where students, young people can be empowered, can succeed in all these beautiful ways.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that that's really so. Adrienne Marie Brown uh, is an amazing writer and has this super dope book called Emergent Strategies. And one of the things that's in Emergent Strategies is small is all, and the small
Hmm.
reflects the whole. But small is all, that was a really important reframe for me because part of the challenge that I have in trying to keep using I statements is sometimes doing this work, it can feel like all of these challenges are so insurmountable. Like they're so big and they run so deep from a top down perspective that it can feel like overwhelming. Like, what exactly can I do when I'm living in this system that's kind of like set up for me to feel like I'm down? And the small is all was really impactful to me because it's like, just like in nature, it's these small changes that happen that then lead to a ripple effect that then shift larger, like how mushrooms work. Like it's this small mushroom working on a thing that's connected with what's my mushroom homies on my left and my right doing that then totally like shift how the whole mycelial network like operates. And so if we're taking gifts from nature because we are of nature and we're just thinking about in our small and the ways that we move in our small iterations and our small interactions that we have, what are some shifts that we can make to be in alignment with the world that we want to see? That's enough, you know? And that will tend to a ripple effect. To your point, if you're talking as a teacher and you're just like, listen, this is the way that I'm trying to move in this classroom, you might inspire other teachers to do the same and then find alignment there and have it just ripples in that way. But it is really, what are some small moves that you can make in your own interaction that will then ripple to the large.
Absolutely, right. um some of those things are like skill building for yourself, some of those things are like having these kind of conversations with your colleagues, your
Yeah.
family members, right, doing this work as a person showing up in whatever spaces that you're in.
Yeah.
So that's the invitation. Time for the questions that everybody answers when they come
Oh,
on this podcast. You already answered the define restorative justice for yourself, so we're going to skip over that one.
okay.
um as you've been doing this work, what's been an oh shit moment, and what did you learn from it? Now you can take this in two
Yikes.
ways. It could be like, oh shit, like I messed up and I wish I did something different, or it could be like, ah shit, I did that and it was awesome.
Oh, that's so that's so good. Okay, what has been an all shit moment? I think so. Harkening back to that, like an oh shit moment was definitely that moment with the student on the bus, um,
Hmm.
because it's like, oh, it's so easy to slip into that. Like it's so easy, and it really could have gone off the radar, and I really could have just ignored it because it could have been quote unquote justifiable. And it
Hmm.
was a moment where I really had to be like, okay, like, but how do I opt in again? Like I was sharing before, like in the world that I want to see, and especially if I'm asking these youth to move, or the invitation for these youth is extended for these youth to move in a certain way. What am I doing to do the same? And then I think like a oh shit moment that's like oh shit is uh hmm I'm like thinking there's like so many great moments with my students, I have to say. I've been fortunate enough in that way. Just having, I think one of these moments, I had a student who came in and we had to move through a lot of different restorative practices with them because there was a lot of compounding challenges. But this person was very quiet. Uh, I think it took like a month to even like hear them speak in like the large group. Um, but when they graduated the program, they gave a speech to the whole class, and they talked about how the ways in which they were held by um, their coach, because each small group had a coach, and then me as the manager of the program, they were just very specific in like being held in this way allowed me to understand that I can practice my voice in these very specific ways. And I'm going to take that with me in the cybersecurity work that I'm going to do. Um, and it just made me really realize the power of facilitation in that way, where it's like, I didn't think that you were going to, I was just trying to move in a way that was in alignment with the world that I want to see. And it was really beautiful to be like, oh, a reminder that their ripple effects are real. There are real ripple effects here, whether you see it or not. And because we had to move through so many processes because of these compounding challenges, I was almost like, I hope that this person doesn't leave with like exhausted, and the opposite happened, and that was, yeah, that was really really sweet.
Apologizing to students, right? Like, is so powerful, right? Because again, like that's that modeling that
Hmm.
we need to do, and like it's probably unexpected from that student. I'm thinking about like even a time when I like justifiably like shut down a student who was being rude
Mm.
in the middle of a workshop that I was facilitating, right? Like I shut them down like effectively,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
And like we're moving on, right? And then
Mhm.
like circling back to that, like they understood, like they were out of pocket. They understood that like I wasn't trying to be mean, but like the way that it came across, the way that I did that, like elicited like an ooh, like
Yeah,
from the
the
rest
worst.
of
Ah,
the class, right?
the
And it's like,
echoes.
dang, like I did not want that to be the impact of it. Like
Mhm.
I'm just like
Mhm.
trying to move on, and like understanding that that's a moment where that student's now embarrassed,
Yes,
right?
acknowledging your
Like
intention but centering the impact. Whew.
right, like making sure that like even though like I'm probably not going to see that person again because like
Yeah.
I don't like I'm not working at that school in that
Mhm.
capacity anymore, right? But what are the ways that like that student is now going to think of restorative justice work? Like, hey, that mean
Mm.
guy who
Yeah.
like embarrassed me about restorative, instead of like, oh, this guy like said a thing, had an impact, right? But then was accountable to it.
Mm. Mhm.
It's super important to like be able
Mhm.
to model.
Mhm.
And then like that second thing that you were saying, right? It was like, yeah, success looks so different,
Yeah.
right? The ability, like just because like that student wasn't like sharing like everything all the time, like doesn't mean that like your work isn't impactful, right?
Mm.
And like sometimes you'll never know the fruits of your work. It's beautiful that you had that opportunity
Yeah.
to hear that on the back end of like the end of that program. But oh, so many good things.
Yeah.
Now,
Super sweet.
now you get to sit in circle with four people, living or
Oh.
dead. Who are they? And what is the one question you ask that circle?
Oh, and what is the one question? Oh man. Okay. Okay, Fred Hampton has to be there.
Hmm.
Um, only one question. Okay, sorry. It's okay. Harriet Tubman has to be there. Polly Murray has to be there. And maybe someone, all those people are dead, so maybe someone that's alive to support in the aliveness of it all. Um, Alexis Pauline Gums. Yes.
So who's sorry, did you say like Polly Murray?
Polly Murray, yeah.
Who is that?
So Polly Murray is their title act their full name would be Reverend Polly Murray, and
Hmm.
they were, I hope I'm gonna get this right, and rip me through in the comments if I don't. But Polly Murray actually was the person that wrote a concept paper. So they did 1,017,000 things, but one of the things that they did was they wrote the concept paper that then became the basis for Ruth Gator Ginsburg argument in the Supreme Court, and also fueled the argument that Thurgood Marshall was using for Brown versus the Board of Education, if I'm saying that one right, because that's not Plessy versus Bergen. Yeah. So Anne was also a, in their accounts, because they have very detailed diaries that they left behind, was a gender expansive person, and had a lot of detailing and chronicling like what the challenges of that look like in trying to move through that. And so there was this person in the same vein of all these people that I'm bringing in, that like had this understanding and like this portal of what being can look like, that was just not alive, or was not um, vivid to the society that they were living in the moment. And so they wrote these papers that were influential. They then became reverend, which was wild, because a black person that was socialized as a woman becoming a reverend was like, wait a minute, what's going on here? Um, and so Polly Murray, yeah, there's a lot of, I could, we would need an episode to talk about all the impacts that Polly Murray has, yeah, on us today.
Can you say that in one sentence or two
Whew,
sentences?
yeah. Polly Murray was a gender expansive person who wrote a lot of concept papers while they were only in college, that became the basis for a lot of foundational Supreme Court cases that were beneficial to all marginalized communities today.
And what is the one question you'll ask the circle?
What is the one question? That's hard. What is the one question I would ask this group of folks? Something like, what is their wish for the future? Like, knowing what you know now, what is your wish for the future? Like the expansion of what you know now for the future. This is hard. I wish I would have gotten this question before, so I could have mulled over
No worries. It's
it.
always better in the moment. And what you probably weren't expecting, maybe you were, is now I'm going to flip that question to you
Oh
to
God, no,
start
I
to
was
close this
not.
out. So, what is your wish for the
Tricky,
future,
tricky.
knowing what you
Okay,
know?
what is my wish? Knowing what I know now, what is my wish for the future? I would say knowing what I know now, which is, especially we're in like this moment of um, these strikes that are happening. We're coming off of the cusp of all these uprisings that are happening in different ways. I think what I know and what has been fortified now is how powerful we are as a collective. And my wish for the future is that our social contract is rewritten to center the collective. And I don't know what that looks like, because I'm not in the future just yet, but that's my hope. And I hope youth and elders are the ones that are writing it.
Dang, sometimes I like to leave those as they are, but like it's hanging, so I leave it there. So, like, I want to follow up.
Please.
When you're saying youth and elders are the one that write it, that's excluding who? Who's that excluding?
That's a great question. Wow, who's that excluding? For me, okay, I have to think of who's that including for when I'm saying excluding. So for me, anyone under the age of 30 would be considered youth. And then anybody over the age of, we'll say like what, like 65 and up would be elders. And then us, we're those that are in those, because math, those that are in the middle of that, that's those are excluded. We're excluded. We're tasked with figuring out how to fuel the vision of the elders and the youth.
I sense that you don't like the framing of that question,
Ah,
which
I
is
appreciate it though.
fine, and like which is fine because and like I'm just reflecting back what I heard. Like you said,
Yeah,
like they're the people who should do it. So like who
yeah.
shouldn't be is the backside,
Mm-hmm,
and then and like the
mm-hmm.
follow up to that is why.
Yeah, that's a great. Okay, so the why you can do. I think that youth have such a palpable um, understanding of what expansiveness looks like, because the depth of programming hasn't happened yet in my brain. That's what I think. And also, um, I don't know. I feel like when you're talking to like, have you talked to like a 7-year old and you're trying to make sense of a thing? I had a teacher professor that's like, if you can't explain something to a 7-year old, then you don't really understand it that well.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and you're just like, but that, like, they'll just be like, come up with these. but why not just do this, this, and that? And you, as a person who's been like programming this way, it's just like, well, because you got to pay your taxes, and
Mhm.
there's all these barriers come to your mind, and that is not the case for, or I should say, in my experience, I have not experienced that to be the case for when you're talking to young people about how things can get accomplished, and also it's their future that they're going to have to inherit. So there's that. And then I think with elders, there's a lived experience and a wealth of um, ways in which they've had to adapt and move. I'm thinking of specifically like Black, Indigenous, Brown people um, that lived. They're like living libraries, and that is important to serve as a foundation to these visions and imaginations that these young folks have for the future. And I think the collaboration of those two elements um, would make for like the dopest world. Like I think about these young people who sued the government. They were like, what, 13, 14 years old who sued the government because they're fucking with their air. 13 and 14-year-olds suing the government because of the like what? That is
Mhm.
so wild. And then I'm curious to know like how what that, collaboration looks like with maybe the elders that were protecting the telescope on one of the islands in Hawaii and were literally
Mhm.
laying their body down. Like what does that cross collaboration look like? And I think especially in indigenous communities you see that more vividly, but I'm just like, we need to scale that up. We need to scale that practice up. So that's where I'm at.
So true. So true. And as we get out of here, we've got the conference, but tell people how else they can support you, your work in the way that you want to be supported.
Yeah, absolutely. I am also a contractor and a consultant doing different work. You can hit me up at info@u360ideas.org. And there's also a website that you can do, and that is u360ideas.org. Please check out forja.org, where you have the registration page for our conference that's happening October 20th to the 22nd. And you can also submit a workshop if you feel so called and moved to. But again, that is on forja.org. And the conference is on the 20th to the 22nd of October.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, again, thank you so much, Q, for your time, your stories, your experiences, the laughs. We'll be back next week, highlighting another restorative justice practitioner doing the work in the South. But until then, y'all, take care.